In a previous shipwreck video, I covered the wreck of USS Astoria, a tough cruiser with a brave crew that came incredibly close to surviving, against impossible odds at that. In this video, we will look at the rest of Astoria's story, from her launch to her early war service, and finally to Savo Island, where this cruiser remained afloat long after her sister ships had gone to the bottom. Astoria looked like she might even have survived for a time. That was not, unfortunately, meant to be. Before we can talk about that, we need to cover the rest of her career. The ship that would become USS Astoria was laid down on September 1st, 1930, as a New Orleans-class cruiser, which is probably where I'll need to clarify something. I've seen the class cited as the Astoria-class because Astoria was the first laid down. This isn't uncommon in naval literature, since you'll see the Colorado-class being called the Maryland-class for much the same reason. This is also done to Pensacola, getting called the Salt Lake City-class instead. In that case, because Salt Lake City was completed first. In Astoria's case, this also comes with a story that the Navy changed the class name after she sank, that it was the Astoria class until the actions off Guadalcanal, and then changed to the New Orleans class after that happened. This is also sometimes tied with major refits as a reason for the name change. Being honest, I'm not entirely sure where this originated. I've looked through various reference books, but the only thing I've seen is a throwaway line in Friedman's U.S. Cruisers, where the 1936 commander of the scouting force called it the Astoria class. Even Friedman himself, who likes his Salt Lake City class or Maryland class, calls these ships the New Orleans class. While I suppose it isn't impossible that this particular ship breaks the American naming scheme, it would be a bit weird. I can't think of a single official case where a ship with a higher hull number becomes the name ship, if both ships are of the same base design, of course. With the notable exception of the Permit class, renamed to that after USS Thresher sank. But that's a very weird exception, and definitely not the rule. For a more contemporary example, we aren't talking about the Saratoga class. This in spite of Saratoga being laid down, launched, and commissioned before Lexington. No, it's the Lexington class because Lady Lex had the lower hull number. If anyone has an official source on this, or even just a written one, by all means point me in that direction. I would be perfectly fine with being proven wrong, but it's just so far outside normal USN policy that it seems a bit off. That one quote from that scouting force commander aside. For reference, USS Astoria was CA-34. USS New Orleans was CA-32. That's where this weirdness is coming from. In any event, Astoria or New Orleans class, the cruiser was the most modern in the Navy when laid down. Displacing 10,110 tons at her standard loading, this ship was right on the Washington Treaty limit for a cruiser. On her treaty-limited displacement, the cruiser carried 9 8-inch, 203mm guns. These were carried in the standard American cruiser layout of 3 triple turrets, 2 on the bow, super-firing, and 1 on the stern. To support these, Astoria also carried 8 5-inch, 127mm dual-purpose guns. These were the secondary battery, and also the heavy anti-aircraft guns. Or the only anti-aircraft guns as designed, aside from a smattering of 50 caliber machine guns. The only other weapons aboard the ship, in her initial layout, were 2 3-pounder saluting guns. By the time Astoria was laid down, the United States Navy had given up on putting torpedoes on cruisers. With the exception of the Atlanta class anyway, but those are very much an exception. With the weaponry out of the way, let's talk armor. Astoria had a main belt of 5 inches at its thickest. This primarily covered the machinery spaces, with a slightly thinner 4 inches dedicated to the magazines. Deck armor, meanwhile, was 2¼ inches thick. Coupled with 8-inch turret faces and 5-inch thick barbette armor, it made Astoria very well protected. within the limits of her tonnage anyway. All of this could reach 32.7 knots on 107,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. Not the fastest cruisers out there, but not slow by any definition either. Now, with the initial technical bits done, let's return to service. Astoria was launched on December 16, 1933. Her commissioning would follow on April 28, 1934. As this was in the middle of the 1930s, you can probably imagine what her initial service largely consisted of, and that was quiet peacetime duty. In fact, upon conclusion of her shakedown cruise, Astoria spent 1934 through early 1939 entirely on simple roles. The cruiser served with the Scouting Force, first as part of Cruiser Division 7, and then as part of Division 6. She went on various port visits, patrols, and training missions during this period. This would, of course, also have included the fleet problems. I've not read anything about Astoria that sticks out in those exercises, however. No, the first thing that really sticks out came in mid-1939. After the conclusion of Fleet Problem 20 in the West Indies, the cruiser sailed north. On March 3rd, Astoria departed for Annapolis, Maryland. Once there, the cruiser would pick up the ashes of Hiroshi Saito, the former Japanese ambassador. Astoria was handpicked by President Roosevelt to carry Saito's remains back to Japan. This was an intentional gesture to thank the Japanese for doing the same in 1925 in reverse. In that case, the Japanese returned the ashes of the American ambassador, Edgar Bancroft. There was probably a vain hope that this gesture of reconciliation might improve relations between the two countries, which were, by 1939, rapidly falling apart. Regardless, Astoria set off for Japan on March 18, 1939. The cruiser eventually reached Japan on April 17th. Escorted into harbor by 3 destroyers, Astoria fired a 21-gun salute. This was returned by the Japanese cruiser Kiso as Astoria docked. Some of her crew carried the ashes ashore later that day. The Japanese, for their part, treated Astoria's crew with friendliness and hospitality. Relations were worsening, but they weren't at war is inevitable levels, at least at that point. Unfortunately, that would come soon enough. After Astoria departed Japan, she returned to her previous peacetime duty. This would not last as long this time, however, as the cruiser was reassigned to Pearl Harbor. There she would remain, joined by the rest of the Pacific Fleet in 1940. A refit in April 1941 saw her return to the West Coast. This largely revolved around fitting more anti-aircraft guns and a mounting point for a, not yet available, radar. Considering those guns were the quad 1.1-inch mount, well, it was something, I suppose. In any event, Astoria, with her shiny new toys, would be assigned to escort duty. She protected USS Henderson on a voyage to Guam in October of 1941. This was done out of a worry about German raiders doing German raider things. No particularly brave German sailors showed up, however, so Astoria returned to Pearl Harbor, although the cruiser wouldn't be present for the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Astoria was assigned to escort USS Lexington when that carrier departed to reinforce Midway. The task force left on December 5th, 1941, with the result that Astoria was hundreds of miles away when the Japanese struck. Fortunate for her in this case, considering how many ships were damaged or outright sunk in that attack. Astoria, for her part, stuck with Lexington as the ship spent a few days searching for the Japanese attacking force. This ultimately came to nothing, which is probably a good thing for the task force, and Astoria returned to Pearl Harbor. This was on December 13th, 1941, and was a short visit. By the 16th, Astoria was back to sea and back to escort duty, with some eager survivors of USS California joining her complement to get back at Japan. Specifically, in this case, she joined up with the relief mission for Wake Island, which also came to nothing. Not a great start, but certainly not because of anything Astoria did. The cruiser would spend the rest of December at sea before returning to Pearl Harbor on December 29th. This was another short visit before she set sail on the 31st to escort USS Saratoga, a mission that began Astoria's unfortunate luck with escorting aircraft carriers. Only a couple weeks later, on January 11th, 1942, Saratoga was torpedoed. Astoria proceeded to escort the damaged aircraft carrier back to port, arriving on January 13th. This was also not a great start, but still not Astoria's fault. The cruiser had no anti-submarine equipment to speak of. In any case, with Saratoga in for repairs, Astoria shifted to escorting first Lexington and then Yorktown. This escort duty saw Astoria sail for the South Pacific, where she supported the air raids on New Guinea on March 10, 1942. Yorktown and Lexington launched airstrikes on Japanese landing forces, while Astoria joined other cruisers to cover the task force's flank. The cruisers would see no action, while the planes ravaged the Japanese operation. The resultant damage prompted the Japanese to dispatch their own carriers to the area, directly setting up for the confrontation that became the Battle of the Coral Sea. This wouldn't come immediately, of course. Astoria, running low on supplies, was detached from her duty in late March. This resupply run took very little time before the cruiser rejoined Yorktown. The resulting patrol duty would be the quiet before the storm. Nothing major happened until after Lexington joined up with Yorktown on May 1st, 1942. The two carriers, operating together once more, raided Japanese landing operations off Tulagi on May 3rd. This was the immediate prelude to the Battle of the Coral Sea. That battle, from Astoria's perspective, began in earnest on May 8th. Japanese air attack on the morning of the 8th focused on the aircraft carriers. Astoria put up the best defense she could, first of Lexington and then Yorktown. By all accounts, the cruiser performed her role well. She took no damage of her own, and her gunners claimed to down 4 attackers. However, this was the early war. Japanese pilots were better, and American anti-aircraft defenses were worse. Lexington was crippled and ultimately sank. Yorktown was damaged and forced to return to Pearl Harbor for emergency repairs. Astoria also returned to Hawaii, arriving on May 27th. She remained there only until May 30th, 1942, when she once more escorted Yorktown to sea. The carrier, repaired in record time, was attached to the American fleet sailing to Midway. Once more, Astoria escorted Yorktown to a carrier battle. This would, unfortunately, not go much better than Coral Sea had done. On June 4th, 1942, Yorktown came under air attack by Japanese aircraft. Astoria put up as good of a defense as she could, but it wasn't enough. Yorktown was crippled once again between 2 different attacks. Astoria would take Admiral Fletcher aboard from Yorktown, while efforts were made to save the carrier. These failed in the end, as the submarine I-168 snuck in and torpedoed Yorktown on June 7th, sending the carrier and the destroyer Hammond to the bottom. Astoria's track record for escorting aircraft carriers can be seen as rough, I suppose, but that would be a bit unfair to her crew. Saratoga had been a submarine. Yorktown's ultimate sinking came from underwater as well. And with her early war anti-aircraft fit, there was only so much Astoria could do against air attack. Her crew did the best they could with what they had. Regardless, Astoria eventually returned to Pearl Harbor on June 13th. She would remain in the area through the rest of June and July on refit and training. It wouldn't be until August 1942 that Astoria returned to the war as part of the Guadalcanal invasion. This came on August 7th, 1942. The initial landings were fairly uneventful on the naval side of things. Astoria supported the landing operations on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. The Japanese didn't really contest these landings, at least at first, other than some air attacks. They had been caught completely by surprise. That would not last long, however. On the night of August 8th, a Japanese cruiser force sailed down the Solomons, intent on attacking the landing force. This would lead into the Battle of Savo Island. Over the night of August 8th and into August 9th, this Japanese cruiser force savaged a joint American-Australian force. The first victims were USS Chicago and HMAS Canberra, the core of the Southern Force. Chicago was damaged, and Canberra was crippled. Neither ship got a warning off to the Northern Force, built around 3 New Orleans-class cruisers: USS Astoria, USS Quincy, and USS Vincennes. These 3 cruisers, unaware of the threat approaching, were surrounded by the Japanese. Around 1:50 a.m. on August 9th, the Japanese, led from the cruiser Chokai, opened fire. Astoria and her sisters were quick to react and return fire, for the most part, but this fire was largely ineffective. Astoria actually avoided damage at first, but the 5th salvo hit her hard. The cruiser's aircraft hangar caught fire, creating a massive blaze, and making her an easy target to aim for. Astoria was then pounded by everything from 5 to 8-inch shells, riddling the ship from stem to stern. Her number 1 turret was hit especially hard, and completely knocked out of action. Even so, the cruiser fought back as best as she could. Astoria would ultimately fire 12 salvos from her main battery turrets, with the final one aimed at a searchlight on the cruiser Kinugasa. This missed and instead hit Chokai's number 1 turret, the worst damage done to any Japanese ship in this action, and a notch on Astoria's metaphorical belt. Unfortunately, that was all she could really do. Astoria was a blazing bonfire, with her foremost turret knocked out. Her engine room was wrecked, and the cruiser's crew had their hands full, just keeping the ship afloat. After somewhere around 60 hits, the cruiser was fighting for her life. Her crew was largely successful in putting out the fires above deck, to the point that Astoria, alone among her sisters, remained afloat when the sun rose. She would, in fact, remain afloat until noon on August 9th. Despite the valiant efforts of her surviving crew, and men put aboard by other ships, the cruiser was ultimately doomed. The fires below decks raged out of control, setting off explosions under the waterline. The cruiser began to list more and more, until the captain was forced to order, "Abandon ship." Astoria rolled over and sank by 12:15 on August 9th, 1942. She took 219 men down with her. The cruiser had fought hard, but in the end, she was just outmatched. As for her wreck, that would eventually be located in 2015. Astoria rests upright on the bottom, with her foremost turret pointing aft. Her bow, meanwhile, detached and came to rest atop the cruiser's stern. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.